In connection to the story in the end of this week's Parsha, V'ini Ishmi b'nei Yisrael ba, a man comes, Zimri comes, Vayakrev el Echav. He brings in front of his brothers, in front of the Yidden, as Hamidyanis, the Midianite woman, that's Cosby, in front of the eyes of Moshe. Chazal tell us, the Gemara says, that Zimri ben Salu brings this Midianis, Cosby Basur, to Moshe Rabbeinu and argues, Zu Asura oy Muteres, is this woman forbidden or is she permitted? V'im Toimer Asura, if you Moshe Rabbeinu are going to tell me she's forbidden, Bas Yisrei mi tirelecha, who gave you the right to marry the daughter of Yisrei? Says the Gemara, Nis Alma Mimenu Halacha, the Halacha was hidden from Moshe. Finally, Pinchas Ra Maisa sees what's going on. V'nizkar Halacha, he reminds himself the Halacha, that Haboyel es Hakusis, someone that has relations with a non-Jewish woman, Kanoim Poigen Boy, the Zealots are allowed to go and kill him. Now, in fact, why was Bas Yisrei muter to Moshe Rabbeinu? So Rashi over there in the Gemara explains that Moshe Rabbeinu married her before Matan Torah, and when the Torah was given, they were all B'nai Noach, and she entered into the covenant of mitzvahs together with them. That means Moshe Rabbeinu married Tzipora. At that time, before Matan Torah, all the B'nai Yisrael were in the gather of B'nai Noach, so he was allowed to marry her then. Then by Matan Torah, she is Megayah, she converts together with the rest of the Yidden, and therefore she remains mutter to Moshe Rabbeinu. So the question is, Zimri is a Nasi Beis Avla Shimoni, he's a leader amongst the Yidden, he's a leader of one of the families of Bnei Shimon. So how is it, what is his argument lechatchila to say, who allowed you to marry Bas Yisra? Does he not know the simple difference between marriage before Matan Torah and after Matan Torah? On the other hand, even if we should find some sort of explanation, even a kasal kadaitach, the beginning of an explanation of why, maybe in this case, this difference between before Matan Torah and after Matan Torah wouldn't be enough to allow Moshe to marry Bas Yisroi. The question still remains, why don't we find in the Gemara that Moshe Rabbeinu or someone else should actually respond, should answer to this argument of Zimri towards Moshe Rabbeinu? All Pinchas says is the halacha is, if someone is acting like Zimri, meaning going and marrying this or living with this non-Jewish woman, he could go and kill him. But we didn't deal with how Moshe Rabbeinu was allowed to marry Tzipora. So there are Mefarshim that say that this itself, meaning this difference itself before Matan Torah and after Matan Torah, that's what was hidden from Moshe Rabbeinu. But the Rebbe says this is difficult. Why? In addition to the fact that Rashi himself says clearly, Nis'alma mimenu halacha, that the halacha was hidden from him. Shenemar loy b'Sinai, that was said to him at Sinai, that haboyel kusis, that someone that has relations with a non-Jewish woman could be killed. In other words, it's only that halacha of what punishment Zimri deserves right now. That's what was hidden from him. And number two, says the Rebbe, it's also a doicha gadol. It's very difficult to say that Moshe Rabbeinu should be hidden from Moshe Rabbeinu, such a simple difference of before Matan Torah and after Matan Torah. But more than that, what's not understood is back to Zimri. How could Zimri even ask this question? Is he able to rely that Moshe Rabbeinu is suddenly not going to know that response? The difference between before Matan Torah and after Matan Torah? It's such a simple difference, then why is Zimri even asking it? We also need to understand. The halacha is that a Giyoris is not allowed to marry a Kohen. A Kohen is not allowed to marry a Giyoris. That's an Isur min HaTorah. The Gemara says that it's learned from a pasuk in Yecheskel, but as Tosfos explains, it's only that Yecheskel is giving us to have some support from Psukim as well. But the Isur itself is an Isur from the Torah. And why is it an Isur from the Torah? Because amongst the women that a Kohen is not allowed to marry, the pasuk says Isha Zoino, and others Lo Yikachu, not allowed to marry a Zoina, and a Giyores, since she is coming from Goyim, Hashtufim Bezima, which are immersed in immorality. So we're assuming, in other words, that she too is a Zoina, and therefore a Kohen is not allowed to marry a Giyoris. Now, regarding Moshe Rabbeinu, there's a machloikus regarding Moshe Rabbeinu as far how much his own kahuna went. That is, according to one opinion, Moshe Rabbeinu was actually considered a Kohen Gadol. Because even though we know that kahuna was taken away from Moshe Rabbeinu, that's only from his children. There's another opinion that holds that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Kohen only for the Shiva Simei HaMiluim, the 7 days of preparation for the Mishkan. So the question is, if Moshe Rabbeinu is a Kohen, and Bas Yisrael is a Giyoris, how is he allowed to be married to him? How is he allowed to be married to her? How is she mutter to him? She's a Giyoris. Now the Rebbe analyzes these two opinions of Moshe Rabbeinu's Kohuna. According to the opinion that we say, that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Kohen only in the Shiva Simei Miluyim, at least B'doichak we would be able to answer that Moshe Rabbeinu was not a full-fledged Kohen. And the fact that he's able to be makriv the karbonis during those 7 days is, as Tosfos explains, because the Mishkan was actually not a full Mishkan either. During the Shiva Simei Miluyim, it had more the din of what's known as a bama. And in fact, that's why Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't wear the big day kohuna during that time. The Gemara says he was mishamish b'choluk lavan, wearing a white cloak, because there's no dinim of big day kohuna in a bama. And therefore, if he's not a full kohen, that's why he could be married to Bas Yisrael Giyores. She's not usher to him. But the Rebbe is not satisfied with this. And the Rebbe says, because besides for the fact that from the Gemara's expression, Loy Niskai in Moshe, that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Kohen only during the Shiva Simei Miluyim, which does sound like he was a full Kohen. But besides for this, what about the other opinion that says he was a Kohen his whole life? So we still have the question, how could Moshe Rabbeinu be married to a Giyoris? Says the Rebbe, seemingly we would be able to actually answer these two questions with each other. In other words, linking the question of the first question we asked, what was Zimri's argument even to Moshe Rabbeinu, and this question now about Moshe Rabbeinu being a Kohen married to a Giyoris. And that is, that when Zimri said, Bas Yisrael mi tirulcha, in fact, what Zimri was arguing was not the fact, how could you be married to a non-Jewish woman, and telling me that I can't be married to Cosby. Rather, his argument was about the Isur of Giyoris to a Kohen. Now, how is that in Zimri's words? What's the connection with this Isur? With the fact that the Midyonis, who Zimri wants to marry, is also Asur, as he says to Moshe Rabbeinu, if Cosby is Asur, who allows you to live with Bas Yisrael? So the connection is, because the reason why a Giyoris is Asur to a Kohen is, as we mentioned before, since she is coming from Goyim who are immersed in Znus and immorality, that means what Zimri is saying is that if the Midyanis is also because she's non-Jewish, then the Bas Yisrael that's also coming from non-Jewish people. And therefore, as we said before, that's the whole point of why she's going to be Asur to a Kohen, because she's coming from non-Jewish people. Hashtufim bezimah, she should be also to Moshe Rabbeinu who's a Kohen. But, says the Rebbe, if this is the case, then the question again is on the other hand. Number one, what is actually the response to this argument of Zimri? And number two, why wasn't Zimri told the answer? Says the Rebbe, seemingly we would be able to answer this based on a Maimer Chazal that tells us that three things Moshe Rabbeinu did on his own and the Eibishter agreed with him. One of them is the fact that he separated from his wife. If that's the case, if Moshe Rabbeinu is separated from his wife, Zimri doesn't have any argument anymore. Bas Yisrael, mihitirulacha, how can you be married to the daughter of Yisrael if there's an Isur of Giyoris to a Kohen? Because in fact, after Matan Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu did separate from his wife. Now, even if you're going to say that separating itself is not enough to remove the Isur that a Giyoris has to a Kohen, there has to be more than just separation. But in truth, Rashi in his Pirush al Torah on the pasuk in the end of Ba'al Oischa, where it says, Vatedaber Miriam was discussing with Aaron about the woman al-Oidei Isha, about the woman that Moshe Rabbeinu had married. Ki Isha Kushis Lakach. Rashi explains on the words al-Oidei Isha, she was speaking about the woman. Al-Oidei Geirusha, about the fact that she was divorced, that Moshe Rabbeinu divorced his wife. On the words Ki Isha Kushis Lakach, that Moshe Rabbeinu had married Isha Kushis, the Ata Gersha, now he divorced her. In other words, according to Rashi, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't only separate from his wife, as Rashi brings it over there, Prisha Ba'alma, but rather he actually divorced her. So if that's the case, so why wasn't Zimri told this? When he says, Bas Yisrael mi tirulacha, that's because, as it's explained in the words of Chazal, that actually no one knew about this. In fact, even Miriam didn't know about this till the whole story with Eldad and Medad, when they were giving prophecy b'machane, and Tzipora says, "Oi, woe to the wives of these people if they're going to be Nevi'im now, so they're going to separate from their wives." And the reason for this is, why didn't anybody know about it? Is because since Moshe Rabbeinu did it on his own, and being very, very humble, he didn't want that anybody should know about this. And this is also why this couldn't be told to Zimri, that Moshe Rabbeinu actually separated from his wife. But the Rebbe says this answer is not really acceptable. Why? In addition to the fact that Rashi, according to the Sifri, actually says that Moshe Rabbeinu separated from his wife, not on his own, but rather that Hashem told him to separate from his wife. When Hashem said after Matan Torah that everyone else could go now back to their tents, to their wives, the Ato and you, Moshe Rabbeinu, stay with me, meaning you stay separated from your wife. And therefore it wouldn't be the opposite of humility to say that he's just fulfilling Hashem's command. In addition to this, says the Rebbe, the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu separated from his wife, as we just said clearly, is because he was a Navi. As Rashi brings from the Sifri, that Tzipora said, woe to the wives of Eldad and Medad. If they're now going to become Nevi'im, they're going to separate from their wives. But based on what we said, Moshe Rabbeinu would have to divorce his wife because of the fact that he's a Kohen and she's a Geiris. So to explain all of this, the Rebbe says, the Rebbe quotes a Mishnah. We know that a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a Almana, a widow. So what happens? We know there's two stages in marriage. There's Erusin, what we call today Kiddushin, and then there's Nisuin, the beginning of the marriage, the first stage and the second stage. If a regular Kohen gives Erusin to an Almana, to a widow, which a regular Kohen is allowed to marry a widow, now the Kohen becomes a Kohen Gadol. He's allowed to finish off the marriage with Nisuin. The Gemara learns it out from the Pasuk, Yikach Isha, the Pasuk that's discussing who a Kohen Gadol is allowed to marry. And Yikach Isha is referring to the first stage of marriage. So it says the Gemara, because Yikach Isha, because the Erusin was by a regular Kohen, that means it was permitted. So now he's allowed to finish off the marriage, and though he's a Kohen Gadol, now he's allowed to marry the Almana. Says the Rebbe, if that's the case, how much more so in our case? By Moshe Rabbeinu's case, when he not only had the first stage of marriage with Tzipora, but the full marriage was completely beheter. Remember that Moshe Rabbeinu marries Tzipora before Matan Torah, way before he's a Kohen or anything like that. So therefore, even after Moshe Rabbeinu becomes a Kohen, Bas Yisrael remains mutter to him, even though she's a Geiris. Now the Rebbe says one may ask on this explanation, that the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu married Tzipora Beheter was before Matan Torah, and since Yidden at that point had a din, as we said earlier, as Bnei Noach, and the whole real geder of a marriage al pi Torah didn't happen yet, so you would assume that after Matan Torah, Yidden would have had to remarry their wives al pi Torah. If the Yidden have to remarry their wives al pi Torah after Matan Torah, then we're back to square one, we're back to the original question. How could Moshe Rabbeinu be marrying her now after Matan Torah if she's a Geiris? But the Rebbe says, really, this is not a question. And the Rebbe says, why not? In addition to the fact, says the Rebbe, which this new marriage would have definitely happened right after Matan Torah, and therefore, as far as Moshe Rabbeinu is concerned, would have been before he became a Kohen, which would have been in the time of the Yemei HaMiluim. This is in the time of the preparation for the Mishkan, etc., which is really almost a year later. Or even if we want to say that Moshe Rabbeinu was his whole life a Kohen, but it still would have started by Matan Torah, even according to that opinion, even if we want to say that, it's still not a question. Why? The Rebbe is about to explain that really the Yidden did not have to remarry after Matan Torah. And the Rebbe explains. On the pasuk regarding Amram, Moshe Rabbeinu's father, where it says, "Vayelech ish mi beis Levi, vayikach es bas Levi." A man from the household of Levi goes and he marries Bas Levi. The Gemara says, "She'asol ma'aseh likuchin," that he went and he did the act of what's considered likuchin, marriage. What does this mean, asol ma'aseh likuchin? That Amram went ahead and was a mekadesher. He now married her with the type of marriage that would be after Matan Torah. In other words, the concept of Kiddushin didn't start after Matan Torah. There was a proper form of Kiddushin by Yidden even before Matan Torah. In fact, says the Rebbe, with this Mefarshim explain a Rambam. The Rambam says, when going through the different mitzvahs of how they came, starting from Avram, etc., the different mitzvahs that the Yidden were given. So it says, of a Mitzrayim, Nitztava Amram b'mitzvahs Yisayris. In Mitzrayim, Amram got some more mitzvahs. And the question is, where do we find any mitzvahs that Amram was given or Amram started? Rather, it's this mitzvah of Kiddushin. The mitzvah of Kiddushin Yidden had already in Mitzrayim. So says the Rebbe, so since before Matan Torah, the Kiddushin by Yidden was already in the same kind of Kiddushin that would have been after Matan Torah, so there would be no need for new Kiddushin after Matan Torah. The previous Kiddushin would remain in full force even after Matan Torah. If that's the case, then once again, when Yikach Isha, when Moshe Rabbeinu marries Tzipoira Beheter, since it was before Matan Torah, and he does not have to marry her again after Matan Torah, therefore he can remain completely married to her. Says the Rebbe, now we could start explaining, number one, what was the argument of Zimri, Bas Yisrael Mi'tir Elacha, and also why Moshe Rabbeinu does not respond to his argument. Zimri did not hold of this limud that Torah Sheba'al Peh will teach us from the words Yikach Isha. He didn't have this tradition, he didn't know this halacha, that Yikach Isha teaches us that if you started the Kiddushin Beheter, then you're allowed to remain married to her. So according to his opinion, Moshe Rabbeinu is currently married to a Geiros, he has to divorce her. So why doesn't Moshe Rabbeinu respond with this limud of Yikach Isha? Why doesn't he tell him, yes, there's a halacha that I was told that Yikach Isha is going to mean that if you married her Beheter, you could stay married, because there's a halacha that if a Talmud Chacham comes to teach a halacha, teach some sort of tradition, some sort of halacha that was not known before, but if he himself has some vested interest in this particular thing, he's in some way biased to this particular case, then he's actually not trusted to say, Kach kibalti, I have this tradition. Moshe Rabbeinu in this case is definitely Negeya B'Dover. It's speaking about how Moshe Rabbeinu can be married to Bas Yisrael. So he can't, so to speak, say that I have a limud for this thing that no one knew about before. The Rebbe says this is similar, that we see also a similar thing by Machloikas Koirach. We know that along with Koirach arguing against the kahuna of Aaron, he also comes with all sorts of false claims and questions regarding a mezuzah. He says a bayis that's molei sfarim, a bayis that's filled with Sifrei Torah, does it need a mezuzah? And what about a talis that's all tchelis, does it need tzitzis? Now we don't actually find that Moshe Rabbeinu should respond with these questions and saying, I have a limud, an oral tradition, limud Torah Sheba'al Peh, why that's not the case. All Moshe Rabbeinu says is, V'imbriya Yivra Hashem, that basically if Hashem chose me, Hashem is going to open the ground over here now and Koirach will be punished, etc. Why doesn't he give him an explanation? But the answer again is, as we said before, Moshe Rabbeinu is in this case an Oigeya B'Dover, the Machloikas is against him and against Aaron, and therefore he anyway, so to speak, wouldn't be trusted with telling us, teaching us now this new halacha. And the Rebbe finishes off with a powerful ayah. The Rebbe says, not always are we looking necessarily to answer the other person's questions. It is possible sometimes that a person with his questions and his challenges, what he's trying to do is to be matir, a non-Jewish woman. In other words, if his kavanah is l'shem shamayim, of course we have to answer him. The Gemara tells us there's two psukim. In one pasuk it says, answer a fool even according to his foolishness. In another pasuk it says, don't answer a fool according to his foolishness. So the Rebbe is explaining, if his kavanah is l'shem shamayim, of course you have to answer, even a fool. When he's asking, says the Rebbe, in matters of divrei Torah with the kavanah to be matir, to permit that which Torah clearly said is asur, then we have to follow the pasuk that says, al tan, don't answer the fool in his foolishness. In other words, the way to win over a person that's completely opposing Torah is not through debates, not through arguments, rather it's to going with a strength that's l'mayla mitam v'das, beyond logic and reason. And the Rebbe says the same thing inside of each and every one of us. When the melech zaken uchsil, when the old foolish king, the Yetzer Hara, comes and tries to confuse the person, then we don't start getting into debates with him. All we need to do is act with strength, as the Gemara says, drag him along to the Beis Medrash. And the Rebbe says this was also the way of Pinchas, Bekanoyas Kinosi, that he comes along and he acts in this way of zealousness. He didn't start getting into debates, because on the contrary, the halacha is, if he would come to ask the halacha, we wouldn't tell him to go and kill her, to go and kill Zimri and Cosby. Rather, it's halacha vein moirin kain. But he went and acted makane kinas Hashem tzvois, kinosi Hashem's kino, and he was moiser nefesh to kill Zimri. The Rebbe now connects us to Yud Beis Tammuz. Says the Rebbe, the Chag HaGeula of Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz falls out in most years in the week of Parshas Bolok, and all of this has a special connection to the Chag HaGeula. The way of conduct, of behavior of the Rebbe, the Baal HaGeula V'Simcha, was in a way of Bekanoyas Kinosi. Notwithstanding all of the various different sort of tinus of certain people, that there's no obligation to be moiser nefesh on every little thing and every little step of the way. By Baal HaGeula V'Simcha, there was the Bekanoyas Kinosi, there was the Kino of Hashem. In other words, since this is something of the Eibishter, on behalf of the Eibishter, he was constantly being moiser nefesh b'poil for spreading Torah and Yiddishkeit. Now, says the Rebbe, Mesiras Nefesh generally can be in a number of ways. One way is like in this parsha. It wasn't the Nasi Hadoir that was having the Mesiras Nefesh. The Nasi Hadoir was Moshe Rabbeinu. It was Pinchas. And it was a way of Gevura. We find that Pinchas hu Eliyahu said, Kanoi kinesi l'shem l'Hashem l'keitzavois. This is a pasuk in Malachim, which once again Eliyahu was sort of fighting the battle for Hashem, and he wasn't even finding a schus for the Yidden at that time. So that's more in a Gevura way. But then there's another way of how it was by the Baal HaGeula V'Simcha. The Bekanoyas Kinosi, the Nasi Hadoir himself, is getting involved. The Rebbe says, in truth, even by Pinchas, the Nesinas Koyach for the Kanayas Kenosi was coming from Moshe Rabbeinu, the Nasi Hadoir. Because Moshe Rabbeinu, when Pinchas said to Moshe Rabbeinu, that I got the halacha from you, that Aboyel Aram is Kanoin Poigin Boy, so Moshe Rabbeinu responds that the one who reads the letter, the one who says what's supposed to happen, should be the messenger to do it. So he also got the Koyach from Moshe Rabbeinu. So really, he gives a Koyach to Pinchas to be Mekane Kinis Hashem. But by the Frierdiker Rebbe, once again, says the Rebbe, the Bekanoyas Kenosi of the Nasi Hadoir himself is in a way of chesed, as discussed many times. The Baal HaGeula V'Simcha, the Frierdiker Rebbe, had asked of his father, the Rebbe Nishmasi Eden, that his Nasias should be bechesed u berachmim. So the Chiddush was that even when it's a case of Bekanoyas Kenosi, he does it in a way of Toiv Ayin Hu Yevoirach, with all the brachos of someone with a good eye, and all in a way of bechesed u berachmim.